Miközben Magyarország a 2026-os választásokra készül, a világ körülöttünk újra rajzolja önmagát. Új hatalmak emelkednek fel, régiek omlanak össze. A politika, a gazdaság és a technológia versenye új korszakot nyit. Ezek a változások nem csak az eljövendő kormány mozgásterét határozzák meg, hanem a mi mindennapi életünket is, hogy mennyit keresünk, hol dolgozunk, mit vásárolunk. Én Papszilárd vagyok, és Unortodox címmel egy interjúsorozatot indítok útjára, amelyben a világ legkülönbözőbb tájairól fogok beszélgetni olyan emberekkel, akik segítenek megérteni, miben is vagyunk, és mi jön ezután. Lesznek jobb- és baloldaliak, konzervatívok és liberálisok, európaiak, észak- és dél-amerikaiak, ázsiaiak és afrikaiak. Ami közös bennük, hogy mernek másképp gondolkodni, és túllátnak a régi sémákon. Unortodox. Új nézőpont a világra. Szeretnénk tudni, hogy mi történik az ismerőseinkkel, barátainkkal, családtagjainkkal, ehelyett értelmetlen ostobaságokat, mesterséges intelligencia által generált szemetet és orbitális mennyiségű reklámot kapunk. Az internet valamikor a szabadság, a haladás, a végtelen lehetőségek szinonimája volt, mára azonban az emberek állandó megfigyelését, személyiségünk áruba bocsátását és ipari szintű manipulációt jelent. Ahelyett, hogy a hatalom nélküliek kezébe adott volna hatalmat, épp hogy a hatalmasok általi elnyomásunk és elhűítésünk eszköze lett, ahogy azt az Orbán rendszer elmúlt 16 éve ékesen példázza. Az internet tehát nagyon elromlott, csak nem tudjuk, hogy hogyan is tudnánk szabadulni ebből a mocsárból. Sziasztok, én Papszilárd vagyok, ez pedig itt az Unortodox, a Partizán globális politikai interjúsorozata, amelyben olyan emberekkel beszélgetek, akik nem félnek kilépni a megszokott gondolkodási sémáinkból. A mai vendégem Cory Doctorow, science fiction író, újságíró, digitális jogi aktivista. Az ő nevéhez fűződik az elszaródás, az enshittification elmélete, amellyel aprólékosan leírja, hogy hogyan is romlott el az internet, de azt is, hogy mit kellene tennünk annak érdekében, hogy orvosoljuk a helyzetet. A témában könyvet is írt, a Nagy Elszaródás című kötet, magyar fordítása épp a napokban jelenik meg az Agave könyvek gondozásában. Ennek apropóján ült le velünk beszélgetni. Mielőtt bemutatnám a vendégemet, el szeretném mondani, hogy mi itt a Partizánnál azon dolgozunk, hogy megérthetővé, átélhetővé, megismerhetővé tegyük a körülöttünk lévő valóságot, és ahhoz, hogy ezt a munkát a legjobb minőségben és fenntartható módon tudjuk végezni, ahhoz szükségünk van a ti támogatásotokra, hiszen ha csatlakoztok a támogatói közösségünkhöz, akkor lehet csak a Partizán közös veletek és független miattatok. Cory Doctorow, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and thank you for sitting down with us.
My pleasure.
So I wanted to start with a bit of a therapeutic question, so to speak. So many of us have the same sensation that the sensation with which your book starts, that everything on the internet, everything online is getting worse and worse. But most of the time we cannot very clearly articulate what is wrong, what is our problem, what's the reason of why we feel that. So for a person who is not terminally online, how would you mirror back what are the reasons of why we feel this everything getting worse online?
Well, I should say that the context for this is that for 25 years I've worked for an NGO called the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and we are a digital rights group. And trying to get people to care about digital rights, it's a little like trying to get them to care about the climate. The issues are very technical. They're very abstract, and typically when you're arguing about policy, you're arguing about things that will happen a long time from now. And for very good reasons, people mostly care about things that are concrete and immediate at the expense of things that are abstract and distant. And so the job of an activist working on these issues is to find ways to increase the salience of them. Sometimes it's a framing device or a parable or a metaphor. I write science fiction novels. Sometimes it's narrative. And sometimes it's a dirty word. And so the dirty word has proven to be extremely successful at kind of bringing people to the table to think and talk about these issues and give them the attention that I think they deserve. So in shitification, it kind of breaks down into three sections. One is a theory or rather a set of observations about how platforms go bad. Mm-hmm. One is a theory about why that's happening now. And one part is a set of prescriptions about what we should do to stop it. And so the descriptive component, I think, it's pretty easy to grasp. Platforms start off by being good to end users, and they find a way to lock those end users in. And once it's hard for those end users to leave, they make things worse for those end users and deliver benefits to businesses. And then they lock the businesses in. And once the businesses can't leave either, they withdraw all the value. And they harvest all the value except for whatever is needed to keep the users locked to the platform and the businesses locked to the users. And then the platform turns into a pile of shit. And we can think of versions of this that apply to, say, Uber or Amazon or Google or what have you. There's been lots and lots of versions of this. But the question is really, why is it happening now? We didn't invent greed in the middle of the last decade. And many of the same people who were running these services then are running them now. Mark Zuckerberg has been running Facebook since he created in his dorm room so that he could non-consensually rate the fuckability of Harvard undergraduates. And, there was a time when he had a service that was good to use, and then he made it into a service that's bad to use. So what changed? What changed with all of these people? My thesis there is that this is a policy question, that we created what you might call an shitogenic policy environment, where because we got rid of competition, we allowed companies to capture their regulators, because companies that don't have competitors can all gang up on their regulators. And that means that we are now living in an environment where companies don't have to worry about the market. They don't have to worry about the government. They also don't have to worry about new companies that don't exist yet, competitors that might come into existence because you've made your service worse, because we've expanded IP law to basically make it illegal to fix these broken products, to reverse engineer them and change them. And while they used to have to worry about their workers, they don't have to worry about that either, because tech workers have gone from being very valuable and scarce to very valuable and abundant. And it used to be 10 years ago that if your worker quit, there were 5 bosses outside the shop who wanted to give them a job. And now it's the case that if you fire your worker, there's 10 workers outside the gate who'll give them a job, who'll take their job. And so that means that bosses just don't have to care if their workers are angry or upset about ruining the products they've made. And so here we are in an environment where the worst ideas that the worst people have are the most profitable ones. And what we get is shitification.
I wanted to bring you a concrete example which has been making me angry for the last couple of months. So I'm
sure.
For some reason in Hungary, Facebook is even more dominant than usually in Europe. So in terms of communication, Facebook Messenger is the primary platform. I use it for work and private communication as well. And because I don't want to go into the main Facebook page, I use the desktop app on my laptop, which was discontinued in December. And then I started using the messenger.com, so the browser version of the Messenger, still to avoid going on the Facebook main page. And now it has been announced that it would be axed in April or May or something, this separate browser version. So now the only way to use it is to go to this glitchy website that doesn't really load your messages and all these kind of things. So the main Facebook page. And so I was wondering, how is it in a market economy, how does it make sense for a firm to have a product that is okay, let's say, and make it worse and still make sense? How does that make sense?
Well, this is a very good example. So Facebook benefits from something economists call the returns to scale, the network effect, where everyone who uses Facebook is a reason for everyone else to use Facebook. You joined Facebook because your friends were there, and then other people joined Facebook because you were there. And the thing about network effects is they're very hard to unwind, because in order to overcome the network effect, you need to solve something called a collective action problem, which is just what it sounds like. Getting your friends to do stuff is hard. Even if you love your friends and even if they're all very nice people, they're a pain in the ass. And the 6 people in your group chat can't even agree on what board game you're going to play this weekend or what bar you're going to go to on Friday. So how are you going to agree when it's time for 200 of you to all leave Facebook? So you're all stuck there. Mark Zuckerberg knows it. He knows that so long as you love your friends more than you hate him, you're going to stay on Facebook. And so he knows you love your friends a lot, which leaves him a lot of latitude to make you hate him, to make you angry. And so he wants to drive you towards apps. And the reason he wants to drive you towards apps is that under copyright law, so Article 6 of the Copyright Directive, which was passed in 2001, it's illegal to reverse engineer an app. Basically, if there's any kind of anti-reverse engineering lock around a software program, you can't remove the lock. That's what the Article 6 of the Copyright Directive says. And it's true whether you're trying to do something legal. So, for example, say you want to remove the lock from your iPhone so that you can install a different Facebook client. Well, that's illegal too. So in 2022, a couple of teenagers made an alternative client for Instagram that took your login and password for Instagram. It's called OG app. And it logged into Instagram, it grabbed everything waiting for you there, and then it threw away all the crap. It threw away the ads, it threw away the boosted content, it threw away the clickbait, it threw away the stuff that had been surfaced from 3 months ago, and it just showed you the things that the people you followed had posted in reverse chronological order. It was so successful that within one day it was in the top of both app stores, in the top 10. And then Meta just sent an email to Google and Apple and they removed it. And that was the end of it, because it's illegal to reverse engineer your phone to install software without the apps. So, contrast this with a web browser. A web browser is designed to be modified. So it's not against the law to modify your web browser. And so more than half of all web users, the majority of people who use technology, have installed an ad blocker for their web browser. It's the largest boycott in human history. And of course, this blocker protects your privacy. It makes your experience better. And no one's ever done this for an app, because it would be a felony. You'd have to break the law to reverse engineer the app to modify it, which is why companies like Facebook are so incredibly horny to get you to use their apps, because an app is just a website skinned with the right kind of IP to make it a crime to defend your privacy while you use it. And so, of course, they want you to use their app. And because they have the collective action problem, right? They know that the cost of you leaving Facebook is the cost of you leaving the people you rely on for companionship, for employment, for logistics in your life. You can't get a handyman, and you can't find out when the bus is coming, and you can't organize your kids' soccer game unless you've got Facebook. And so he knows that the cost would be really high for you to leave Facebook. So he just says, all right, from now on, you're going to access Facebook properties using an app that I can spy on you with and manipulate you with and abuse you in a million ways. And it's against the law for anyone to start a new business that would compete with Facebook by making its app better. So I know I don't have to worry about that. The other companies that provide social media, they're just like Facebook, because he bought all the ones that were different, like Instagram, and made them just like Facebook. And we let him do it. We let him buy all of his companies. In the European Commission, when he wanted to buy WhatsApp and when he wanted to buy Instagram, they said, okay, but you can't spy on Instagram users. You can't spy on WhatsApp users. That's the condition of the merger. And he said, okay, I won't. And then he did. And then we didn't do anything about it. So we just let him break the law. So here we are, right? That it's like true. Mark Zuckerberg's a terrible person. If you had him over to the house, you should count the spoons when he leaves, right? He's a dreadful human being. But like the reason he's doing it is the same reason your dog licks its balls. It's because we let him do it, because he can.
What you are saying, of course, with the collective action problem and the high costs of switching explains why we are trapped in bad services. But there's also a criticism that says that, okay, these are basically free services, whether you can think about Google or Facebook or all the other email clients and all these things. So you cannot have the same expectations. You as a consumer, you cannot have the same expectations as you would have with some paid service, because basically they are giving it to free. In a sense, they are subsidizing your comfort and your communication, all of these. What would you say to this criticism?
So it is true that firms, in order to be sustainable, have to have income. But, let's talk about Google here for a second, because Google obviously is very surveillant. Google didn't have a business plan when it started, right? You remember they just lost money. They used venture capitalist money to just keep running. And then after the dot-com crash in 2001, they needed to make money. And they had an idea. It was called AdWords. And AdWords was an auction for a little ad, like two little ads at the top of the screen. It was one originally, then it was two at the top of the screen that would match your query. And so you search for trainers, and different people will have bid on the right to show you an ad about trainers when you're searching for trainers, and that goes at the top. Now, this was done without you logging in, without them setting a cookie, without them knowing a single thing about you. This was not behavioral advertising. It was content-based advertising. And Google was extremely profitable on the basis of content-based advertising. So they could operate their business without having to worry about these privacy questions. Without having to spy on you. But they wanted more money. And of course, every business would like more money. If you're a physicist and you're saying, well, what is the ideal experimental environment? You might say, okay, well, imagine a perfectly spherical cow of uniform density traveling on a frictionless surface, right? That is the perfect conditions for your experiment. And if you're a business school professor and someone says, what is the perfect business? You'd say, well, this is a business that charges infinity for its outputs and pays nothing for its inputs. And, yes, that is academic publishing. But every other business that's not academic publishing has to accept less than infinity for its inputs, for its outputs, and has to pay more than zero for its inputs. They have to find an equilibrium. And that equilibrium doesn't come down off a mountain on two stone tablets. It's meant to be determined by market forces, which are cabined by regulation, by what is legal and what isn't legal. So we have lots of payment processors on the internet. And oftentimes the payment processor doesn't charge the buyer anything, right? So if if you're using PayPal, maybe you don't pay anything and the seller pays the commission, or vice versa, right? Someone doesn't pay and someone does. Now, that payment processor could charge a 3% commission and make a certain amount of money. They could charge a 6% commission and make more. They could charge a 75% commission and make more. And they could charge a 100% commission. They could just not give any money to anyone and make more. And we understand that when a business says, I would like to charge a 50% commission, and we say, well, the market has pegged you at 3%, and 100% is actually just stealing and will put you in prison. No one says, well, how are you supposed to run a payment processor if you can't charge 60%? We just say, tough shit, right? This is as much as you can get. So how much cost can Google impose on you? How much can they spy on you? How much can they distract you with ads that aren't the best match for what you search for? That's not a thing that Google gets to unilaterally decide. That's a thing that is arrived at through a dynamic in which people do all kinds of things to indicate whether or not they think Google's offer is fair. Maybe they go to another search engine, but maybe they install an ad blocker, right? And if you're Google and you're having a product meeting, and the person leading the meeting says, now, great folks, I've been doing some math. I know that our bonus depends on our increasing this KPI, this key performance indicator, and that is click-through rates on the website. I think if we make the ads 40% more invasive, we can make 2% more money. And then we all get a big bonus. We're going to go to Switzerland and go skiing this Christmas. And someone in that meeting might put their hand up, and even though they don't give a damn about the product quality or about the user's well-being, they might say, Elon, I love how you think, but as it occurred to you, when you make the ads 40% more obnoxious and invasive, 75% of our users are going to use our search engine to type, how do I block ads? And when they do that, we don't get any more money from them ever again, because no user's ever gone back to Google and typed, how do I start seeing ads again? And so there is a discipline imposed by users being able to bargain, right? If you go to the tourist market, when I was in Budapest, I went to the the tourist market where they sold all the terrible communist junk. And I wanted a candle shaped like Lenin, and they wanted some amount. And I said less amount. And we went back and forth, right? The seller didn't get to just reach into my pocket and take my wallet, right? And choose how much money this was worth. We had to bargain. And the way that you bargain on the web is in part by changing how your technology works. But if you think about the person who's designing the app, right? So you're designing the Google app, and you're at that meeting and you're like, all right, folks, we're not going to make the ads in the web more obnoxious, but I had the same idea for the app. Why don't we make them 40% more obnoxious there? Same person's going to put their hand up and they're going to say, why are you stopping at 40% more obnoxious? Why don't we make them 400% more obnoxious? Right? Because what are users going to do? It's against the law to block the ads. So why don't we make this as bad as possible? And so, that's the first part of my answer, right? That just because it's ad supported, it doesn't mean that it should be all ads, or they should violate your privacy with impunity, or that there should be no limit on the non-monetary costs they can impose. The other thing I'll say is that if you own an iPhone and you spent 1,000 euros on the little distraction rectangle in your pocket, it's not something you got for free. You're paying for that product. And indeed, in 2019, Apple added a little checkbox. And if you check that checkbox in iOS, it blocks Facebook from spying on you. 96% of iOS users click that box. The other 4%, I assume, are either drunk or Facebook employees, which makes sense because if I worked at Facebook, I'd be drunk all the time, right? So that sounds great. It sounds like Apple is helping you bargain with Facebook. Certainly, Facebook, in their next shareholder meeting, announced that they expected they would lose $10 billion that year because of this checkbox, right? Which tells you people don't want to be spied on by Facebook. But at the same time that Apple was rolling this out, they rolled out commercial surveillance on iOS. They gather all the same data that Facebook used to gather through your iPhone, and they use it to power ad targeting. The exact same thing that Facebook was doing. And again, this is not a free phone. You gave them 1,000 euros for your phone, and they spy on you. Because even if you're paying for the product, you're the product. The thing that stops firms from treating you like the product isn't using money instead of attention to pay for the service. It's whether they can get away with treating you like the product. And if they can, they will. And so I just reject this idea that just because it's ad supported, there should be no limits on how badly they treat you. And even if you pay money, you're going to be treated just as bad.
But are you saying here that this is usually how monopolies or quasi-monopolies work, or there is something else here? Because of course, if I'm thinking about the classical US examples of monopolies, like the oil or the railways and everything, there you don't have the opportunity to build up as an individual. You are not going to lay down new train tracks, or you are not going to build a new drilling station offshore or something like that. But your ad blocker example and all this is that we have as individuals some kind of an agency here. So this is a difference, or just normally this is how monopolies work?
So obviously firms that have pricing power and can escape discipline will use that to increase the value that they harvest at the expense of the value that they deliver. That's just how markets work. This is why when you go to the other side of the airport checkpoint, the water suddenly costs 5 times as much as it does when you're on the near side of the checkpoint, because you can't go anywhere. It takes forever to leave the airport and get more water. But there are specific intrinsic characteristics of digital technologies that change how monopoly and counter-monopolization strategies work. And those specific technical characteristics are half Hungarian. So the digital computer, formally, if you're a computer scientist, it's called something. It's something called a Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine. And the Turing part, that's named for Alan Turing, who's an Englishman. But the von Neumann part was named for János von Neumann, who was a Hungarian. So it's because of Hungary that we have this modern digital computer. And the modern digital computer is a calculating engine capable of computing every valid program. We don't know how to make computers that can just calculate some programs. Once you make a computer, it can calculate all the programs, which means that once you have a computer that's your own, if someone reaches into it and installs like sort of a 10-foot pile of shit in the program that you use every day, a programmer can make a 4-meter ladder out of code that they can costlessly, instantaneously distribute to everyone in the world. And they can give one of those ladders to you and you can go right over the pile of shit. And so in a state of nature in which we haven't made it illegal to reverse engineer and modify technology, every time someone did something bad, there would be an obvious countermove. As you say, this is not like, in the 1890s, when the American railway companies were taking everything from the farmers. So basically the amount that they took from the farmers, they were like the academic publishers. They took everything, right? It was like, we will take all the money that you expect to make from getting your product to market, less the smallest amount that we can leave you so that you grow another crop next year, and everything else is being taken by us, right? And if you're like someone looking at that and you think, well, first of all, that's bad for the farmers, but also I bet they pay me to take their goods to market. You couldn't just click a mouse and make more train tracks, right?
Yeah.
It was hard. It was like a big logistic, capital intensive project that cashed out to what economists call a natural monopoly. Typically you get one set of rail tracks between A and B, not two, because it just doesn't make any sense to have a second competing set of tracks and so on. So with digital, because it's so flexible and because it's so, you can costlessly alter the kind of digital landscape, you can just click a mouse and make train tracks. Companies that attempt to acquire monopolies, really what they do is they induce entrepreneurs to enter the market with rival products. And we see this with web browsers, right? Where, there's just these ad blockers that are now ubiquitous. The majority of web browsers have an ad blocker in them, right? Because that's just like what happens. When there's too many ads, you just get ad blockers, right? You get these moves and counter moves. But the corollary of this is that the flexibility of digital allows firms to costlessly, instantaneously alter the business logic of the offerings they make to you. And so, for example, Amazon can reprice its goods based on what they anticipate that you are willing to pay. So in the United States, Amazon charges teachers more than they charge other consumers, because they know that the teachers aren't looking as closely at the prices. So if you order for your classroom and you use the school as your shipping address, it costs more than if you use your home as your shipping address. That's something that like a merchant would struggle to do. If you walk into a stationery store and say, I need a box of laser printer paper, they don't know who you are. They don't have any way of adjusting the price. They can't just do this sort of instantaneously. And when you add digital to something, it just becomes much more flexible. You can change the search rankings, you can change the recommendation systems, and you can do it on a per user, per interaction basis. So like Uber drivers, if they are more picky about what rides they take, so they only take rides that are worth a lot of money, then they are paid more per kilometer than if they're less picky and if they take rides that are worth not much money, because Uber is inferring that they're more economically vulnerable if they'll take bad rides. And if they're more economically vulnerable, you can pay them less, right? And of course, that makes them more economically vulnerable and so on. And if you're picky and you start taking rides that are more valuable, once they kind of got you in the habit of clicking yes, they start to erode the wage, and they do it by very small increments and at very random intervals, which are really hard for the human sensory apparatus to detect, especially when you only have a few seconds to say yes or no on a ride. And so eventually they push you down into that lower wage, and they're just toggling up and down and gradually eroding you. And the idea is to kind of push you in a posture where whatever it was you had as another source of income that lets you be more picky about Uber, you eventually get rid of it because Uber's paying well. And then they push you down into this lower equilibrium. And so that's also intrinsic to digital. And you can see how the flexibility of digital and the fact that you can always make a counter app or modify the technology would serve as a tonic against this per user, per interaction modification. But when IP law steps in and criminalizes those kinds of modifications, then you have this environment in which firms have all of the flexibility of digital to exploit and prey upon you, and consumers and workers have none of the flexibility of digital to defend themselves. And it's the worst of all worlds.
Of course, there's the saying that hindsight is 2020, and the process of enshittification, you describe how the firms or the platforms are being very good to the users to attract them, then trap them through these network effects. Then they start selling these users to the businesses, trapping the businesses there, and then after that they just start screwing over the businesses as well. So this is the neat picture. But how can we discover the early steps? So to give a concrete example or put a concrete question in these terms, are we seeing the same things with AI now? So the fact that OpenAI is introducing ads, and Anthropic is now deciding to lower safety standards despite being the pioneer of AI safety in a marketing sense. Are these symptoms, early symptoms of enshittification, and how do we recognize?
Well, I think they are, but there's a foundational difference between web technologies and AI technology. So the web, when it started, lots of companies were losing money, but web technologies had what are called good unit economics. It just means that like every per unit sold or unit of service delivered, the companies grew more profitable. So every time we added a new user to the web, that made the web more valuable. Web companies made more money. Every new generation of the web cost less to deliver and was more profitable, and so on. And that's the opposite of AI. AI has the worst unit economics ever. Every user of AI costs the companies more money. So every time they add a user, they lose more money than they did beforehand. Every time that user uses AI, they lose more money. Every generation of AI costs more, and every generation of AI loses more money. They have now lost $700 billion, right? That's the total cost of AI deployment to date. Their gross revenues are $50 billion a year. They say it's 60, but 10 billion of it is the money that Microsoft gives to OpenAI and OpenAI gives to Microsoft. That's not really revenue, right? That's like if I give you $1 and you give it back to me, nothing's changed. And if I have to do something to get the dollar back from you, like if you're walking down the street and there's like a teenager in a green apron who gives you a voucher for a Starbucks latte, and you go into the Starbucks and you get a latte, Starbucks didn't just make $7. Starbucks is out the cost of the latte, right? They're poorer than they were, not richer. And yet Microsoft says this is $10 billion in revenue. It's not, right? So they're making $50 billion a year. They've spent $700 billion. They are depreciating the GPUs in data centers on a 5-year schedule. So they say after 5 years, they have to replace it all, but they're actually replacing it every 2 to 3 years because it's burnt, because the GPUs melt down, right? So they have 3 years at $50 billion a year to make $700 billion. But it's worse than that because now they say they need $3 trillion. And also like the 7 companies that dominate AI, the Magnificent 7 that are like 31% of the S&P 500, they're just like trading the same $100 billion IOU back and forth and pretending that it's in all of their bank accounts at once, which again is like not how accounting works. And so, in finance, there's this law, Stein's law, that anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. And so there's a pretty good chance that long before OpenAI is like fully enshittified and whatever, it's just going to be out of business, right? It just like, even if you like zero out all the costs of the GPUs, right? Like even if they go bankrupt and tomorrow you and I can go to the data center and buy the GPUs at a 95% discount and plug them in somewhere else. It's still going to cost so much in electricity to run them, and they burn out so quickly that within a couple of years, we'd be out of business too, right? It's not to say that AI isn't valuable. It does valuable things. It's fine. If it was a normal technology and not something associated with this like world-threatening bubble, we'd just call most of this stuff a plugin. Like, you know, like, do you remember when like you could make yourself into a cat on Snapchat? No one was like, oh my God, I think we invented God. We should fire everyone. And also we should spend all the money in the world on this. They were just like, you have a plugin for your social media app. Programmers have been getting plugins for their IDEs forever, their development environments that let them do things like automatically wireframe code or, you know, produce like subroutines, blank subroutines and so on. And AI, it's like, it's an advance on that. It's a new thing that makes that better. And so, you know, if we weren't also talking about a giant AI bubble, we would just say, oh, I've got a new plugin for my code development environment that's saving me some time. That's nice. Not like, I think we taught so many words to the word guessing program that it became conscious, right? Which is an idea like if we just keep breeding horses to run faster, one of them's going to give birth to a locomotive. It's just silly, right? So, you know, I think many of these questions are quite moot because they are dependent on the idea that AI in a form recognizable today will still be around, as opposed to like open source models running on commodity hardware that we just treat as normal technology, which I think is what AI is going to be in a few years. Not before it does a whole ton of damage, right? Like when the bubble pops, it's going to make 2008 look like the best day of your life. It's going to be so bad, right? Like if you're looking for a safe investment now that you can't put money into the economy because it's all exposed to AI, buy long poles so you can dig through the rubble for canned goods. Like it's so bad, right? But like, it's bad in a completely normal way. It's bad in the like South Seas bubble way, not in the like we accidentally made computer God and it turned us all into paper clips way, you know?
Yeah. I want to talk a bit, or I have a couple of questions about the solutions part, but my first would be just quickly, do we really want a solution? Because at the beginning, you also mentioned this, that how difficult it is for digital rights activists to make us conscious. And if I'm thinking like, yeah, I've been reading your work, I've been dealing with these topics for a couple of years now, or more than a couple of years, but still I'm producing content for YouTube. And most of my friends are just like very happy about being able to pay a lot for Apple to spy on them because their gadgets are just superior in comparison to others. And of course, if I produce videos about, I don't know, EU regulations on big tech, it's the worst watched videos that I've ever produced on our channel. So it's kind of, do we really want to save ourselves?
So what you're sketching out there is an economic theory called the theory of revealed preferences. This is a kind of neoliberal economic theory from the kind of Reagan, Thatcher, Helmut Kohl years. And what it says is that like, what people say they want is not as important as what they do. And you can understand that this has got a certain intuitive sense to it, but it only makes sense if you don't have power factored into the way that you think about your analysis, right? And of course, neoliberal economics, it's a kind of neurological injury that makes you incapable of perceiving or reasoning about power. So it's no wonder that you get these theories of revealed preferences. But, you know, the theory of revealed preferences says that if you sell your kidney to make rent, you have a revealed preference for having one kidney, right? And I actually think if you sell your kidney to make rent, it's because you are trapped in a terrible situation. And one of the ways you can actually find out what people prefer is by giving them viable alternatives. So what if you gave people a box that let them not be spied on by Facebook and 96% of them clicked it? Would you say that you've discovered a preference to not be spied on, right? And the fact that Apple won't give you that box for iOS doesn't mean that people don't like being, that people don't mind being spied on by Apple. It means they don't have a box to click. And they love their friends and they love the data that they have and they love the utility that they get and they love the ability to use their technology more than they hate being spied on by Apple. It doesn't mean they like being spied on by Apple. And, you know, I think the thing that we've arrived at now is quite exciting because American technology is so defective in so many ways. It doesn't just extract privacy costs from people, although those privacy costs are becoming very visible to people in lots of ways because it's not just, I don't know, like bots saying that Ukrainians are going to attack the power plant in the week before the election, right? And tailoring that message to you. It's stuff like being paid less because the company is spying on you and knows how much you're willing to pay or willing to work for. And so they raise prices or lower wages. And so people are experiencing extremely pointed privacy harms that make them more concerned about privacy than they used to be. And at the same time, these technologies are so defective that lots of people are looking at them and going, I could make a lot of money if I were allowed to compete with them. When Facebook kicked off, its pitch was, we are like MySpace, except we're not owned by a billionaire and we don't spy on you. And no one should use social media that's owned by a billionaire, and no one should use social media that spies on you. And people kind of like the sound of that. Yeah. People kind of like the sound of that, but it wasn't enough, right? Because you're on MySpace because of your friends, right? And going to Facebook and just rereading their privacy policy in smug isolation while you waited for your stupid friends to get wise and join you on Facebook was a non-starter. So what Mark Zuckerberg gave MySpace users was a bot, and you gave your login and password to that bot, and it would go to MySpace several times a day, log in as you, grab everything waiting for you, put it in your Facebook feed, and then you could reply to it and push it back out to MySpace. And it meant you could eat your cake and have it too. If you did that to Facebook, they'd destroy you. They do what they did to OG app, right? So there's lots of people out there going, I bet people would pay for a version of Facebook that didn't suck, right? You're living in this moment where you're stuck using Facebook, but you can't find the messages that matter to you. You have to use their garbage app or this janky web browser thing. Maybe you would pay €5 a month for a version of Facebook that didn't suck. And if all I'm making is the software that fixes Facebook, and I don't have any of Facebook's expenses, €5 a month times 4 billion Facebook users worldwide, or Meta platform users worldwide, starts to sound like a very good business, right? So you now have entrepreneurs who are going I think maybe I'd like to turn America's trillions into my billions, right? And leave the rest as a consumer savings for everyone else. And then finally, you've got people who are national security hawks, who are waking up every day and going, wait, what did Donald Trump do with his technology platforms? Right? That the dictator of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, gets convicted of crimes, and Donald Trump has Microsoft shut down the Supreme Court justice's internet, right? He doesn't have his Outlook account anymore. He can't see his email. He can't get his calendar. He can't get anything. He's been kicked out. And then the International Criminal Court did this to Benjamin Netanyahu for genocide. And then Donald Trump did the same thing, and Microsoft cut them off. I was just in Canada talking about this for the Chief Information Officer of Canada's annual summit. And the entire government of Canada runs on Microsoft 365, right? And Mark Carney, our prime minister, he goes to Davos and he says, the old world order is dead. We are pivoting away from America. We're going to do trade deals with China to import BYD cars from now on. And Donald Trump gets really angry. And they're sitting there going, what if he shuts off the government, right? What if he just shuts off the government of Canada? Now, in Europe, you have the Eurostack, right, which is this project to build alternatives to American big tech. They're building the software, they're building the data centers, but they need to get the data off, right? If you're a large firm or a government ministry or even a household, and you got thousands or millions of files and data structures that are tied up in these American silos, and you want to move them to the Eurostack, you're going to need some way to jailbreak those apps and get that data out. So now you have kind of three armies that have been summoned up by Donald Trump to fight the American internet and disenshittify the world and build a post-American internet. You have digital rights hippies like me who've been trying to do this for 25 years. You've got entrepreneurs, many of whom have just fled America ahead of a masked ice goon who wants to shoot them in the back or send them to a Salvadoran slave labor camp, right? And then you have national security hawks. And some of them are worried about America and some of them are worried about China because they're like, wait, we just replaced all of our power infrastructure with Chinese solar inverters and Chinese solar batteries, and they're all connected to the Chinese cloud and they can all be disabled at the stroke of a mouse. And so we'd better reverse engineer those and install open source firmware on them too, right? And so you've got these three groups of people who all have different constituencies. They all access power in different ways. And that's the kind of coalition that actually makes change. Change arises when coalitions of disparate groups that have disparate kind of valences and disparate grasps on power in society want the same thing, and they collaborate to get something more than any one of them could get on their own.
You seem to be a bit optimistic. That's good to hear in this respect. So I wanted to ask you, because yes, Europe has all these regulations, GDPR, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, AI Act. And of course, I'm coming from a country whose governing party has been spending crazy amounts of money on Facebook and Google, like, I don't know, in the 2024 European parliamentary elections, the party alone spent more than the parties in Germany together or something like that. So,
sure.
And now of course, the political
Maybe Viktor
ads
Orban
are...
really likes Facebook.
Yeah, the political
Maybe
ads are banned, but still
he loves shrimp Jesus. He loves hearing from his high school friends. He's just really into it.
Yeah, probably. So I wanted to ask you, so we have these regulations, and you might want to say what your opinion on these regulations are. But my primary question would be, what else is there to be done? So what would be the three big things that the EU member states should do as first steps? Because of course there's these all these vulnerabilities you talk about. So we don't have cables, we don't have chips, we don't have cloud infrastructure, we don't have software, we don't have...
So the EU has been out in front of tech regulation for many years, and they faced a couple of significant problems. One was domestic and one was international. So the domestic problem is Ireland. And that's why the GDPR failed, because all the enforcement happens with American tech companies, all happen in Dublin, where they all pretend that they're headquartered. And the reason they pretend they're headquartered in Ireland is because the Irish government lets them cheat on their taxes. But there are other countries in Europe that will let you cheat on your taxes. There's Malta, there's Cyprus, there's the Netherlands, and there's Luxembourg. And if you have enough accountants and lawyers to pretend that you're Irish this week, you could pretend you're Luxembourgeois next week. And so they have to keep them happy. And the way you keep them happy is by not enforcing the law. And so Meta and Google have been violating the GDPR since it was passed, and all the cases went to Dublin and died there. And it's only getting worse. So the Irish data commissioner they just appointed is an ex-Meta executive. And one thing we know about Meta executives now, thanks to the whistleblower Sarah Wynne Williams, is that they're not allowed to ever criticize Meta. So Sarah Wynne Williams was a Meta executive. She was their head of international relations. She quit and she wrote a tell-all whistleblower memoir called Careless People. It was a #1 New York Times bestseller last year. And it turns out that her employment contract with Meta required her to agree to something called non-disparagement and non-disclosure. So non-disparagement is you're never allowed to say anything mean about the company. Non-disclosure is you're never allowed to tell anyone what happened while you were there. But she also signed something called binding arbitration, which says that if they accuse you of violating the non-disclosure and the non-disparagement, a judge doesn't hear that case. A lawyer who works for Facebook decides if you're guilty. And that lawyer has fined her.
So basically beauty filters are free speech, but telling your opinion is not free speech.
So Facebook's lawyer, their arbitrator, has fined Sarah Wynne Williams $111 million without ever disputing the truthfulness of the things she said. So the new Irish data commissioner is under these same contractual terms, almost certainly. And they're Facebook's top regulator in Europe, right? So like Ireland it's difficult, but European federalism, like all federal systems, has this vulnerability that member states can act as kind of regulatory arbitrage points or as havens for crime. And if you try to crack down on them federally by limiting the power of the states, right? So if you say from now on, crimes committed by companies in EU member states are heard in the federal court, in the ECJ, and not in the member states courts. Well, countries like Hungary that have an active separation movement that are trying to get out of the EU are going to use this as fodder to say they've taken away our sovereignty, right? Law breaking is no longer heard by our judges. It's now heard in Brussels or in Strasbourg. And that is a powerful tool. And so that kind of federalism is just very hard to overcome. And then there's the American problem. So during the Biden years, the Biden administration was very hostile to big tech. And so if Europe secured a judgment against an American tech company, they could probably enforce it in America, if they wanted to. So the DMA and the DSA, for non-compliance with various clauses, they have these incredible fines, like 5% of the global gross turnover per day of non-compliance, right? But that's not the money that like Apple or Google have in a bank in Europe, right? That's in a bank in America. And so to get that money, you need a court order that can be enforced in America. And Donald Trump's not going to let you enforce that court order. When the European Commission tried to get Apple to behave itself and offer alternative app stores, Apple first said, okay, we'll only offer alternative app stores if the alternative app stores are approved by us, their apps are approved by us. We can delete that approval at any time and you will lose all the apps you've installed and all the data you have. We will charge junk fees that exceed the fees that we charge for current apps. And also, if your phone leaves the European Union for 21 days, we're going to delete all your apps and your data. Right. And they were able to just sort of drag that out through the courts for a whole year without complying with the DMA. And then they briefly said, actually, we're just not going to sell phones in Europe anymore. And people kind of laughed at that because they're not going to like leave a market of 500 million affluent consumers. Right. And then they said, fine, we're just going to sue you in Ireland. And they brought more than a dozen lawsuits in Ireland. It's going to take 10 years to unwind them. So it seems pretty clear that as things stand now, the European Union and its member states are going to struggle to actually change the behavior of these companies. But there's one thing that the European Union has total discretion over, 100% control, that they can control with total fidelity. And that is whether or not the European courts are available to Apple or Google or Facebook or these other companies to destroy European companies that fix the defects in their products. Whether or not Article 6 of the Copyright Directive is enforced in Europe is a matter for Europe. And Apple gets no say in it. Meta gets no say in it. Google, Oracle, they have no way of changing whether or not Article 6 is enforced in Europe and how it's enforced in Europe. And the European companies that rely on Article 6 are not good, right? It's almost all American companies that rely on it. But you have Mercedes, who now will, they sell you the car, but they rent you your accelerator pedal and you have to pay a monthly subscription fee. Otherwise, the accelerator pedal only works half as well. BMW sells you your car, but they only rent you your high beams. And if you want your high beams to dim when there's oncoming traffic, you have to pay a monthly subscription. Nobody is going to go like, oh, well, someone who will think of Mercedes and their rental accelerator pedal, right? There's a company in Ireland called Medtronic. That's the largest med tech company in the world. They don't let hospitals fix their own ventilators. They require you to have a Medtronic technician type an unlock code to certify that the repair was done by Medtronic. So during lockdown, hospital technicians couldn't fix their own ventilators. Terrible. There's a Polish company called Nuvog that makes trains, and they booby trap the trains. If the train senses that it has been brought to a rival's service yard, the train bricks itself, and then they charge you 20,000 euros to do remote diagnostics to fix it. And they were like, we don't know why our trains are breaking. Sure is weird. And so one of the train operators in Poland hired some security researchers who revealed that they had like put these like, essentially explosive charges in the code of their trains, right? And they sued the security researchers and a Polish member of parliament for criticizing them because it said, oh, you violated Article 6 of the Copyright Directive. So getting rid of Article 6 of the Copyright Directive in Europe, it's just a no-brainer, right? And when you do, you can unleash European technologists. And like maybe, Europe might not ever have another Nokia, but like Nokia had a hard business because they had to like make hardware in China and then ship it around the world and fix it when it broke. But instead, they could wait for like Apple to make the phones and sell them all over the world. And then a company in Budapest or in Helsinki or in, the Azores could go into business selling jailbreaks for iPhones that let you install a different app store. And instead of making $100 billion a year on transaction fees, charging 30%, they could charge 3% and make $10 billion a year, which is a lot of money. And, Apple can suck rocks. Right? Because like tough shit, you went into business and you thought that, you would make a bunch of ancillary service revenue and you got greedy and you convinced your customers they should go somewhere else. Sucks to be you. That's a you problem, not an us problem. Right? And that I think is like the thing that Europe could 100% do. They could do it tomorrow and it would solve more technology problems than the DMA, the DSA, the GDPR, and the Digital Fairness Directive all together.
Mm. Thank you so much, Cory Doctorow, for sharing your ideas. The Hungarian translation of anti-shitification can be bought. I will put a link in the description as well. Thanks so much for coming to Partizán.
Oh yeah, thank you. It occurs to me I should mention I'm coming to Budapest for a festival called Brain Bar, and I'm going to be there September 16th through 18th. So I know not everyone in Hungary lives in Budapest, but if you happen to be in Budapest, you can come see me.
Ez volt az interjúm Cory Doctorow íróval, digitális jogi aktivistával. Ez az adás az Unortodox interjúsorozat keretében készült, amelyben olyan emberekkel beszélgetek, akik segítenek megérteni a körülöttünk lévő világ rohamos átalakulását. Ajánlom, hogy nézzétek meg az Unortodox korábbi részeit is, a Partizán csatorna lejátszási listái fül alatt megtaláljátok a többi Unortodox adást is. És hogyha érdekelnek ezeknek a globális politikai átalakulásoknak más aspektusai is, akkor ajánlani tudom a köztes névre hallgató hírlevelemet is, amelyet a www.papszilárd.eu címen értek el. És ne feledjétek, ha nem akartok lemaradni a Partizán legkülönfélébb tartalmairól, akkor kövessétek be a csatornát, kövessetek minket a különböző közösségi médiás felületeinken, és támogassátok a munkánkat anyagilag is, hiszen, hogyha csatlakoztok a támogatói közösségünkhöz, akkor lesz a Partizán közös veletek, és független miattatok. Munkatársaim nevében is köszönöm szépen a megtisztelő figyelmeteket, én Papszilárd voltam. Sziasztok!
Egyre magasabb a feldolgozottság, és egyre biztosabb a végeredmény is. Április 12-én Magyarország rendszert választ. Nézzük végig együtt. Partizán. Közös veled, független miattad.